Live from Washington, this is BBC News. Sir Keir Starmer says the UK is ready and willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of a possible peace process ahead of an emergency meeting of European leaders. Israel's Prime Minister says he's working to make President Trump's plan to take over Gaza and resettle the population a reality. And papal thriller Conclave wins Best Picture at the BAFTAs, Britain's top film awards. Hello, I'm Ritika Gupta. Welcome to the programme. We begin with some breaking news that Britain's Prime Minister says the UK is ready and willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of a possible peace process. Sir Keir Starmer said he feels very deeply the responsibility of deploying British servicemen and women in harm's way, but that helping to guarantee Ukraine's security is an existential issue to Europe. Writing in the British newspaper The Daily Telegraph ahead of an emergency meeting of European leaders in Paris, Sir Keir added that a security guarantee from the United States is essential for a lasting peace, and only the US can deter Vladimir Putin from attacking again. Sir Keir's comments come amid accelerated Western efforts to bring Russia's war to an end. Two senior US officials are heading to Saudi Arabia to begin direct talks with Russia without Ukraine. A short while ago, US President Donald Trump said he plans to meet with Russian President Vladimir Putin very soon. Take a listen.
I think he wants to stop fighting. I see that. We spoke long and hard. Steve Witkoff was with him for a very extended period, like about 3 hours. I think he wants to stop fighting. They have a big, powerful machine, you understand that. And he wants to stop. That was my question to him, because if he's going to go on, that would have been a big problem for us. And that would have caused me a big problem, because you just can't let that happen. I think he wants to end it, and they want to end it fast. Both of them, and Zelensky wants to end it too.
But as the Munich Security Conference wraps up, the rift that emerged there between the US and Europe remains. Our diplomatic correspondent James Landell has more.
A bleak day in Munich as diplomats headed home after their security conference, still reeling from US suggestions that Europe will play little part in talks to end the war in Ukraine. But tonight, from America's top diplomat, a change in heart, or at least some words of reassurance.
If it's real negotiations, and we're not there yet, but if that were to happen, Ukraine will have to be involved, because they're the one that were invaded. And the Europeans will have to be involved, because they have sanctions on Putin and Russia as well. And they've contributed to this effort. We're just not there yet.
Today, Marco Rubio was in Israel before heading to Saudi Arabia, where the first talks will take place. But they will involve only US and Russian officials. Sources in Kiev said Ukraine was not invited. And in Munich, senior US diplomats were clear about what they saw as Europe's limited role.
Can you assure this audience that Ukrainians will be at the table and Europeans will be at the table?
The answer to that last question, just as you framed it, the answer is no. The answer to the earlier part of that question is yes. Of course the Ukrainians are going to be at the table.
President Macron of France has hastily arranged a meeting of European leaders in Paris tomorrow to discuss how best to respond to what some fear could be their damaging exclusion from American diplomacy.
And whoever is going to be involved in those talks is Europe needs to be a part of this process. Ukraine needs to be a part of this process. If not, this type of ceasefire is not going to be credible.
A Kremlin spokesman said Russia was keen to speak to the US about peace and not war. But NATO leaders said Europe had to be involved in keeping any peace.
We needed to provide security guarantees to Ukrainians, because if that's not the case, Russia can always leave and ultimately rearm and reinvade.
Also still resonating was the US Vice President's accusation that Europe was suppressing free speech, including populist views.
And what I worry about is the threat from within.
An ideological attack, some fear, signals a wider transatlantic breach. All the while, the war in Ukraine continues, as does the sacrifice of so many. With US support more uncertain, Will Europe now step up to fill the gap? James Landell, BBC News.
And for more analysis, let's bring in the senior advisor to the Centre for Eurasian, Russian and East European Studies at the Brookings Institute, Angela Stent. So, Angela, welcome. And we just had that news that UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is willing to put troops on the ground. Are we starting to see European leaders taking a much stronger stance on involvement in Ukraine?
Yes, I think what the Munich Security Conference, as your correspondent indicated, symbolized for everyone is the beginning of the US withdrawal from Europe 80 years after World War II, and when we started to build such a robust relationship with Europe. I think the Europeans realize that they will have to step up. It's been made clear by all the U.S. officials who were at Munich that there won't be U.S. backing there. So I think it's very important, the meeting that's going to take place tomorrow in Paris and with British troops. But I have several questions about that. I mean, I think all the Europeans understand that if there is no U.S. force to back them up, this is going to be very difficult. And I would be very surprised if Vladimir Putin would agree to have Europeans on the ground as part of a peacekeeping force.
And Angela, staying with that, President Trump is sending senior officials to Saudi Arabia for talks with Russia on peace, but Ukraine says it's not been invited to those talks and will not be sending a delegation. So what is the significance of that, and what does it mean for those peace negotiations?
Well, the significance is that, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin want to sit down and make a deal about Ukraine. I think it's highly unlikely, by the way, that it's going to succeed. What's going to happen, I think, this week in Riyadh is that Secretary of State Rubio is going to meet with Foreign Minister Lavrov, and they're going to work out the details of a Trump-Putin summit. There will be other discussions with other Russian representatives there. But obviously, you cannot have any kind of peace deal that's going to work without Ukrainian input and also without European input, even though General Kellogg, of course, has said that the Europeans won't be involved. So my understanding is that the Ukrainians at some point will be involved in some way, but it's clearly not yet. And I think what you see now is General Kellogg is going to Kiev now to talk to the Ukrainians, but he's not involved in the discussion with the Russians. So I'm really not sure how this is supposed to work.
So, Angela, in this hastily arranged summit tomorrow with European leaders that'll take place in Paris, this comes, as we've mentioned, US envoy saying that Europe won't have a seat at the table in those talks. How should Europe be reacting to that now, and what power do they actually have to make sure that Ukraine doesn't get steamrolled in these negotiations?
Well, I think there has to be very close coordination between the major European countries and Ukraine, which there already has been, but I think they have to step it up. If you listen to what President Zelensky said in Munich, he understands that too. And so they will have to do everything they can to make sure that even if they don't have a seat at the table, that their views are respected and that they're consulted by U.S. officials. I think that would be the first step they have to take. But again, I think without any U.S. backing, if there were to be a ceasefire and some kind of a peace agreement, without any U.S. backing, it's going to be much more difficult for the Europeans to ensure that the peace is held. And without security guarantees from both Europe and the United States, Ukraine will be very vulnerable to attack again if there is a ceasefire, when Russia decides it's recouped and wants to continue trying to subjugate Ukraine.
Angela, in terms of the deal, I mean, Trump and many of his officials have said that it's unlikely Ukraine will get all of its land back. So what do you think a deal that they propose to Ukraine might look like?
I mean, I think what they're going to propose, if, again, we listen to what U.S. officials have said, is that Ukraine accepts the fact that Russia is now occupying most of these 4 territories that it has annexed, and that there is no prospect of NATO membership, at least on the horizon. They're supposed to accept that. But again, without security guarantees, it's highly unlikely that Zelensky would be prepared to accept these terms. He's already said that. And therefore, I think there are going to have to be some compromises, because at the moment, it's not clear what Russia's giving up at all. I mean, what the Trump administration has proposed is more or less what Putin's plan is for at least ceasing this war at the moment.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much to Angela Stent of Brookings Institute.
Thank you.
Now, several hundred people gathered to Moscow to mark the first anniversary of Alexei Navalny's death, exactly a year after the Russian opposition leader's suspicious demise in a prison camp. People laid tributes at Mr. Navalny's grave, despite prior warnings from the Kremlin that authorities would be closely monitoring those taking part. Our Russian editor Steve Rosenberg has more on those tributes pouring out for Alexei Navalny from Moscow.
In Moscow, this was a day for remembering. The Kremlin's fiercest critic. Alexei Navalny died 1 year ago, behind bars, in suspicious circumstances. The authorities had called him an extremist, but to his supporters, he represented hope for a democratic Russia. Flowers for a grave, a simple gesture, but in today's Russia, it is not without risk. Those seen as sympathetic to Mr. Navalny can have problems with the authorities.
For the people coming here today to lay flowers, that takes a lot of courage, because there are a lot of police, a lot of security, and individuals who are clearly not journalists filming every face in that cemetery.
Among the visitors here were Alexei Navalny's parents, Anatoly and Lyudmila. As they reached his grave, there was spontaneous applause. And then this. Thank you, they cry. We're doing everything to ensure that a criminal investigation takes place, Lyudmila says. We want those who murdered him to be punished. I'm sure that someday the truth will prevail. Alexei Navalny was Russia's most prominent opposition leader. He became its most famous prisoner. The authorities deny any connection to his death. As for his memory, some Russians, it seems, are trying to keep that alive. Steve Rosenberg, BBC News, Moscow.
And to Israel now, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's working to make US President Donald Trump's plan to move and resettle Gaza's population a reality. He made the comments alongside America's top diplomat as Marco Rubio made his first visit to the region as Secretary of State. Rubio said President Trump's plan to relocate Palestinians may have shocked people, but that it took courage for Trump to propose an alternative to tired ideas of the past.
The president's also been very bold about his view of what the future for Gaza should be. Not the same tired ideas of the past, but something that's new, bold.
Mr. Rubio and the Israeli Prime Minister presented a united front on Hamas and Iran, outlining shared goals like dismantling Hamas's military and governing capacity and securing the release of all Israeli hostages.
We have a common strategy, and we can't always share the details of this strategy with the public, including when the gates of hell will be opened, as they surely will if all our hostages are not released.
Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman has been travelling with Secretary Rubio and filed this report from Tel Aviv.
Well, the talks between Secretary of State and Israeli Prime Minister lasted more than 3 hours, after which we had those comments from Mr. Netanyahu that the gates of hell would open on Hamas if all of the hostages weren't released. Now, this, of course, echoes the kind of language that Mr. Trump has been using when he set out an ultimatum to Hamas last week. I think the question is about whether there is now a genuine change of approach by the Americans and the Israelis, in effect, to disregard or to move away from the current phased framework for a consolidated ceasefire in Gaza and the gradual release of the rest of the hostages. Now, the second 6-week phase for that has yet to be agreed between Israel and Hamas. So the alternative analysis of all of this is that it's basically posturing initiated by Mr. Trump in order to sort of ramp up the pressure on Hamas. I think it's still not clear which of these two things, or perhaps a combination of those, we're currently looking at. Nevertheless, the language and the rhetoric clearly very, very strong. We also heard from both men about the source, as they see it, of all of the destabilization in the region. They put blame on Iran, both emphatic, saying that Iran can't be allowed to get a nuclear weapon. The key issue there is about the approach. We've long known that is the position of these two allies, but the question really is whether Mr. Trump wants to pursue a deal, an agreement with Tehran in order to offset and end their nuclear program, or whether ultimately he would allow the Israelis to pursue military action against the Iranians. Now, in all these things, I think much hangs in the balance. A key move now from Mr. Rubio as he heads off to Riyadh in Saudi Arabia on Monday. Ultimately, the administration is trying to put pressure on the Arab countries to step in when it comes to a future plan for Gaza. And I think we're going to hear more of that from Mr. Rubio as the day progresses on Monday.
For more on all of this, let's go live now to Javed Ali, Associate Professor at the University of Michigan and former member of the FBI and National Security Council. So welcome. We've just had that sixth swap of Israeli hostages and Palestinians, and that is part of the first phase of the deal that will be ending soon. And we know Israel's Security Cabinet, they're going to be discussing the next phase of this ceasefire on Monday. So how much support is there from both sides for this phase two, and how fragile is it looking?
Thank you for having me this evening. And with respect to next steps, phase two technically won't start until, I believe, March 1st. So there's still a couple of weeks to go. But based on all these developments that have happened, even over the past 24 to 48 hours, it seems like we might be at an inflection point where there is hanging over even phase one, the prospect for a new direction from Israel backed by the United States to basically resume very significant military operations if all the hostages, remaining hostages aren't recovered or sent back to Israel. And that backs up the language that the previous segment just talked about. And is that bluster? Is that an actual reflection of, again, this shift in strategy? It's so hard to know. But based on just, again, from today into yesterday, it seems like the tone and the language is definitely shifting.
Yeah, and speaking of that tone, in the press conference earlier, we heard Netanyahu praising Trump. He called it a bold vision for Gaza's future, saying that he and Marco Rubio had discussed how to ensure that Trump's plan on Gaza becomes a reality. He even said that the gates to hell would break loose if hostages weren't returned. So this kind of language, do you think this is going to help or hurt in getting the ceasefire deal to the next phase?
Well, we would have to sort of try to get inside the minds of the Hamas leaders in Gaza and perhaps in other locations like Qatar and Egypt, and also with the Iranian government that backs Hamas as well. What do they think is the next best step for Hamas and Iran in this multi-dimensional sort of ordeal that they're in? Is it to sort of relent and not agree to the phase two and phase three, but return all the hostages? And as the previous segment also suggested, maybe that opens up the aperture for another kind of deal with Iran to also lower the hostilities between Israel and Iran, and Israel and Iran and the United States. I mean, that's a potential. But if not, the alternative is, again, a resumption of very aggressive military operations. And we heard Secretary Rubio say today and Prime Minister Netanyahu that Hamas needs to be dismantled as a military organization, that all the hostages need to be recovered. And the only way Israel would be able to achieve that is through the kind of operations we saw for 15 months in the aftermath of October 7th.
And Javed, going back to Trump's plan for Gaza, I mean, that requires cooperation from the neighboring countries. Egypt, Jordan, they both rejected it. Saudi Arabia, which is a U.S. ally, has rejected it. So is this plan realistic, especially when it doesn't have the support of these regions?
Well, again, this is so difficult for us to know from the outside looking in, but it was part of the rhetoric that Secretary Rubio and others have talked about for the plan being so controversial and so different than anything that folks have heard from U.S. leaders over several decades. As part of that, designed to put pressure on countries like Jordan and Egypt, who would be in what appears to be the plan that President Trump is backing, that they would accept some significant number of Palestinians relocated from the Gaza Strip. And another indicator of how this political dynamic may be shifting is the fact that Secretary Rubio is going to Abu Dhabi and meeting with officials from Saudi Arabia and Turkey to think about, again, next steps for the Trump plan. But that does not apparently include representatives from Jordan and Egypt. And I think there is a signal being sent from the Trump administration to the Jordanians and to the Egyptian government that if they don't come up with a different proposal or accept the U.S. one, that they may be cut out of it entirely.
All right, and we will have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Javed Ali of the University of Michigan. Now let's take a look at some other headlines. Rwandan-backed M23 rebels have seized Bukavu, the second largest city in the eastern DR Congo, after facing no resistance from government forces. Some residents cheered as fighters marched in, though many remain fearful. The city's fall marks an expansion of M23's control in the mineral-rich region following their recent capture of Goma. The UN warns the violence, which has displaced hundreds of thousands, risks triggering a wider regional war. A stabbing attack in Austria has been linked to the Islamic State group. Authorities charge a 23-year-old Syrian asylum seeker after he allegedly killed a 14-year-old boy in the town of Villach. 5 others were wounded. Authorities said the suspect was radicalized online in a short space of time. Police said a delivery driver, also a Syrian man, drove his vehicle at the attacker and prevented further casualties. President Trump flew over the Daytona 500 aboard Air Force One before taking a tap on the Beast, the presidential limousine. He also greeted drivers before the race. Last weekend, Mr. Trump made history as the first sitting president to attend the Super Bowl. And the papal selection thriller Conclave has been named both Best Film and Best British Film at the BAFTA Awards. There was also big success for The Brutalist, a 3.5-hour epic about a Holocaust survivor who carves out a new life in America. Our culture editor Katie Razel reports from the ceremony.
It's the British film industry's chance to roll out the red carpet and get the Hollywood A-listers posing in freezing February temperatures.
Selena, to your left!
Favourite for Best Actor was Adrian Brody for his role as a Holocaust survivor in The Brutalist. The film was up for 9 awards. Its director told me there'd be upsides to not winning.
Not having to make a speech is kind of a win, I will say. You just sort of black out up there.
BAFTA's also about homegrown talent. The team behind Wallace and Gromit brought them along, and Britain's finest were out in force.
Well, this carpet has been taking some real pounding over the last few minutes, a sure sign that the ceremony is about to begin, because the real stars of tonight, the nominees, are now here, including, of course, Ralph Fiennes, up for Best Actor, and we will find out soon whether tonight will be about rewarding British talent.
Why, that's vengeance. Most foul.
Early on, BAFTA did.
Wallace and Gromit.
Wallace and Gromit's Aardman team winning a new category, Best Children's and Family Film.
Quick one. I haven't got my glasses on, sorry.
As well as Best Animated Film for the first time ever for Vengeance Most Foul, watched by around 20 million people. American Zoe Saldana won Best Supporting Actress for her role in Emilia Perez.
You are pretty.
Her co-star, the trans performer and Best Actress nominee Carla Sofia Gascon, wasn't there after derogatory remarks she posted on Twitter surfaced, but she got a mention.
My wonderful cast, Carla, Selena, Edgar, Adriana.
Mikey Madison.
The major upset was Demi Moore, favourite to win Best Actress, but beaten by Mikey Madison for her tour de force as a lap dancer in Anora.
Adrian Brody.
Adrian Brody did win Best Actor, and his director did have to make a speech.
Best director, there's no such thing as best.
4 wins in all for his Brutalist.
The supervision of the selection. This is a duty I never thought I'd have to perform.
4 wins, too, for papal thriller Conclave.
Conclave!
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 Including not just outstanding British film, but the highest accolade, Best Film. It leaves the Oscars race still wide open. Katie Razzle, BBC News.
And Hong Kong's first twin panda cubs made their public debut on Sunday after much anticipation. The 6-month-old siblings, currently nicknamed Elder Sister and Little Brother, were revealed to the public for the first time at Ocean Park's Panda Sanctuary, drawing hundreds of visitors who queued for hours to catch a glimpse of the fluffy duo. Their mother, Ying Yang, made history last year as the oldest giant panda on record to give birth, delivering the twins just a day before her 19th birthday. And before we go, a reminder of our breaking news this hour. Britain's Prime Minister saying the UK is ready and willing to put troops on the ground in Ukraine as part of a possible peace process. British soldiers, if needed, would deploy the troops from the other European nations alongside the border between Ukrainian-held and Russian-held territory, writing in the British newspaper, The Daily Telegraph, ahead of an emergency meeting of European leaders in Paris. We'll be with you again at the top of the hour. See you then.